13. Ghana Zwizina. British tech millionaire Barry Pring fell quickly in love when he met a young Ukrainian stripper named Ghana Zwizina in 2006. He persuaded her to leave her job with the promise to financially support her, and the couple married the following year. Pring and Zwizina celebrated their first wedding anniversary over dinner in Kyiv. While awaiting a taxi outside after the meal, Zwizina said that she'd left her gloves in the restaurant and rushed back inside, leaving Pring alone on the street. Witnesses would later claim that he was staggering and seemed intoxicated. Out of nowhere, a stolen car with fake license plates and no headlights fatally mowed Pring down. His family immediately suspected that Zwizina had drugged Pring or was involved in his death in some way. But his body was embalmed and returned to the UK with his liver and kidneys missing, making it impossible to run a toxicology test. Within days of her husband's death, Zwizina flew to Britain and tried moving into Pring's home and claiming his assets. In the meantime, Pring's family took action to stop her from cashing in and spent copious amounts of money investigating their suspicions. A private investigator discovered that a restaurant employee had offered to call a taxi for Pring and Zwizina after their anniversary dinner, but Zwizina had declined. During the meal, Pring had complained about a burning sensation in his chest, further pointing toward the possibility that he was poisoned. The family filed a wrongful death lawsuit, and a judge initially ruled that Pring had been unlawfully killed after being lured into the street. But Zwizina won a bid to overturn the findings and a new inquest was granted. Pring's family eventually dropped the case against Zwizina, and she received a six-figure payout from her late husband's $2 million estate. 12. Rachel and PORSHA Lee. Ralph Range Jr. grew up working on his family's 1,200-acre tree farm in Gaston, Oregon. He never handled the business's finances and didn't fully understand how wealthy his family was, or that he stood to inherit more than $10 million in assets. And despite being a kind and likable person, Rains was a socially awkward loner who never married or had kids, leaving him lonely and longing for companionship well into his 50s. In 2004, Rains visited a psychic shop in Bend, Oregon, hoping for some answers about his life and future. There he met Rachel Lee, who gave him a psychic reading. They got to talking, and Ralph confided in his new friend about how he wanted a wife and children. He also shared details about his family's business that made Lee's ears perk up. She could tell that the lifelong bachelor was worth a lot of money and began hatching a plot to inch her way into his life and get her hands on his fortune. As the friendship between Rains and Lee grew over time, so did Ralph's generosity. In 2006, he bought Lee a $915,000 house. It was a lot nicer than the ramshackle home Rains lived in. But he was a simple man, and he was so thankful for Lee's time and attention that he didn't mind spending massive sums of money on her. Later that year, Rains hired Lee to care for his father after he had a stroke, paying her nearly $9,000 a month. He also hired Lee's husband, balancing Lee to do yard work, most likely for a wildly inflated pay rate. As Lee sunk her claws further into Ralph's checkbook, she persuaded him to give her power of attorney over his money and assets, claiming that she was an experienced bookkeeper who could manage his finances. She immediately began draining his funds for her own use and bought multiple properties, including 4 psychic shops. Lee was just getting started. In 2007, she introduced Rains to her daughter PORSHA. It was around that time that Rains met a young British woman named Mary Marks at the Portland airport on his way home from a tree farm convention. He was instantly drawn to the young blonde, completely unaware that it was PORSHA Lee in a wig. She was faking the British accent and had collaborated with her mother to craft Mary Marks' persona based on Rains' description of his dream woman. In reality, Mary Marks was the name of Rachel Lee's mother. The scamming duo used it as the name for Ralph's dream girl because it enabled them to deposit money into the real Mary Marks bank accounts and then transfer it to themselves. Mary convinced Rains that she needed someone to marry her to avoid getting deported from the United States. She drafted bogus marriage papers, which Ralph eagerly signed, and only lived with him part-time, claiming she had a job in California. Rains believed for years that the two were married, even though they were never intimate. In 2010, he signed the house which he'd bought for Lee over to Mary, which PORSHA then proceeded to transfer into her own name. He also forked over a continuous stream of money to the woman he believed he was married to. Rains had no idea that Mary and Rachel Lee knew each other before he introduced them, and he saw PORSHA Lee multiple times over the years, but never made the connection that she was Mary. The women took their scam even further when Mary told Rains she wanted to conceive a baby through in vitro fertilization. She collected a sample from Ralph, and when she turned up pregnant, he was thrilled to learn he was going to be a dad. Little did he know Mary wasn't Mary, and the baby certainly wasn't his. When the baby was born, Rains dove right into fatherhood. He loved the little boy, and he thought it was his son. To make the story even crazier than it already is, the first baby Ralph met was PORSHA's. But she gave custody of the child up to his real father. To keep up the ruse, she borrowed her sister's baby, who was around the same age, and used him as a cover. PORSHA went on to fake a pregnancy in 2012, making Ralph believe that he was going to be a father again. She wore a fake baby bump and then told Rains that she'd miscarried. Meanwhile, the Lees continued spending lavishly on luxury cars, travel, and other splurges. The scheme finally fell apart in 2014 after police saw wildly expensive cars parked outside Rachel Lee's psychic shop and became suspicious. Ralph Rains was devastated to learn that the last 7 years of his life with Mary Marks had been a lie. By then, his scammers had sold most of his tree farm, and he had just $200,000 to his name. Following an investigation, authorities charged Rachel, PORSHA, and Blancy Lee on a slew of charges. Rachel was sentenced to 8 years in prison, while PORSHA received a 33-month sentence, and Blancy was handed a 2-year term. 11. Sandrine DEVILLARD. Marcel Onfou was a recluse who spent his entire life living in a wooden shack near the French village of Puy-Saint-Pierre. Nicknamed the Hermit of the Alps, he got by without electricity or running water. Anyone who didn't know him never would have guessed that he was a multi-millionaire, but between his low-cost lifestyle and the growing value of the land he owned due to increased tourism in the region, Onfou had amassed a fortune. He could have made even more money by developing his land as a resort, but he instead filled his property with several chalets, where he let friends and family stay for free. It was perhaps only a matter of time before someone offered to buy Onfou's land. That someone was a glamorous real estate agent named Sandrine DEVILLARD, showing up on the eccentric millionaire's doorstep in 2010. Onfou refused to sell his property, but was awestruck by DEVILLARD's beauty and offered to take her on a date. Long story short, he fell head over heels for the blonde bombshell, and the couple married the following year. To say they were an unlikely match would be an understatement, and it carried some concerns among Onfou's loved ones about DEVILLARD's intentions. They became even more suspicious when the couple continued to live apart after tying the knot, with DEVILLARD remaining headquartered in Paris while Onfou stayed firmly planted in his ramshackle cabin. Just a year after marrying, the pair were in a car accident while riding with 2 of DEVILLARD's friends. Everyone survived except Onfou. Rumors began to swirl about DEVILLARD allegedly orchestrating her husband's death. Seemingly unconcerned by the gossip, DEVILLARD told Onfou's friends and family that she planned to develop his property and that everyone living on it had to move. The car crash that killed Onfou was ruled an accident, and DEVILLARD was cleared of any wrongdoing. But she soon learned that Onfou had revised his will shortly before his death, leaving everything to the very people she was trying to kick off his land. In a lawsuit, DEVILLARD argued that the signature on the will was forged. A judge disagreed and upheld her late husband's decision to leave her empty-handed. 10. Des Campbell. A lot of people automatically think of gold diggers as women, but that's not always the case. Former Australian police investigator Des Campbell had a long-standing habit of living beyond his means and was constantly in debt. So he probably thought he'd hit the jackpot when he met a wealthy widow named Janet, who inherited a large sum of money after her husband died in 1997. Janet was infatuated with Campbell, who denied to others that they were in a relationship. Just a week after the clandestine couple married secretly in 2004, Janet bought a lavish home outside Sydney and bestowed nearly half of her estate to Campbell. Over the following months, Campbell had multiple affairs while continuing to deny that he and Janet were in a relationship. Meanwhile, he insulted Janet behind her back, calling her pig ugly and making it clear that he had no attraction to her whatsoever. In early 2005, Campbell took his 49-year-old wife on a camping trip to Royal National Park. Janet wasn't much of an outdoor gal, so it's safe to assume that the outing was not her idea, and that it may have even required some persuading to convince her to go. She was also afraid of heights, so it was more than a little strange that the couple pitched their tent just feet away from the edge of a 164-foot cliff. Shortly later, Campbell showed up at a police station claiming that he discovered Janet's dead body at the base of the cliff after she disappeared during a trip to the restroom. It initially seemed like a terrible tragedy, but law enforcement soon began to suspect foul play. Just a week after Janet's death, Campbell asked for access to her will. Around the same time, he skipped Janet's funeral and took one of his girlfriends on vacation. He proposed during the trip. Campbell denied allegations that he pushed Janet off the cliff in order to kill her and get his hands on her money, but a jury was unswayed by his claims of innocence and convicted him of murder. He was sentenced to 33 years in prison and remains behind bars after unsuccessfully appealing the ruling. 9. Saki Sudo. Nicknamed the Don Juan of Kishu, Japanese billionaire Kosuke Nozaki admittedly spent millions of dollars wooing thousands of beautiful women. The 77-year-old thought he'd finally found true love when he married 22-year-old adult actress Saki Sudo in 2018. He did so despite all the warnings from his friends and family that his much younger bride was only interested in his money. Nozaki was a smart man. He noticed that Sudo preferred to spend most of her time away from home, and that she had a penchant for shopping trips in far-flung destinations like Italy and Dubai. But he was happy with the quality of her company during their limited time together, so he tolerated his wife's absences and lavish spending. The couple's newly wedded bliss was cut short just 3 months into their marriage, when Nozaki was found dead in his bathroom. A toxicology test revealed high amounts of narcotic stimulants in his system. Suspecting that Sudo was responsible for his death, police launched an investigation that would end up dragging on for nearly 3 years. Sudo reportedly wasted no time taking over her late husband's company and making plans to leave Japan. But she failed to relocate before the COVID-19 pandemic began, and her move was delayed. In the meantime, investigators uncovered a growing pile of evidence pointing toward her possible guilt in Nozaki's death, including internet searches for stimulant drugs and poisons. They also discovered that Sudo hid her marriage from family and friends in her hometown, instead telling them that she landed a high-paying job and was affording her lavish lifestyle with her own earnings. Sudo was indicted for Nozaki's murder in 2021, and the case appears to be ongoing. 8. SHAINA and SHALAINE Foster. When a wealthy 84-year-old Manhattanite named Paul Aronson found himself wanting the company of a younger woman in 2014, he turned to a sugar daddy dating website. He connected with a young woman named SHAINA Foster, who agreed to meet him for a second date if she could bring along her twin sister, SHALAINE. Aronson may have been thinking the more the merrier when he agreed to the plan, but instead of having twice the fun, he received a double dose of terror. After splurging on an expensive meal, the octogenarian invited the sisters to his upscale townhouse for drinks. The twins readily agreed, but unbeknownst to Aronson, they had much more sinister things on their agenda than enjoying a nightcap. Armed with zip ties, SHAINA and SHALAINE bound Aronson to his coffee table and cleaned out his wallet, taking $500 cash and all his credit cards, then left him lying helpless on his living room floor while they went on a shopping spree. A neighbor discovered the ailing senior citizen 20 hours later. When law enforcement caught up with the Foster sisters, they reportedly claimed that Aronson made them uncomfortable and tried getting them to do things they didn't want to do. SHAINA, who took the heat for the crime and admitted to being the mastermind, described Aronson as ugly, old, and disgusting. She even went as far as saying that he deserved what happened to him. SHALAINE's lawyer claimed that his client only watched her as her sister carried out the robbery. Authorities charged both twins in connection with the incident. SHAINA took a plea deal and admitted to 1 count of robbery in exchange for a 5-year prison sentence. The court agreed that SHAINA was the primary actor in the plot and allowed SHALAINE to plead guilty to robbery in exchange for a prison sentence of 1 1/3 to 4 years. 7. Stacey Mendoza. While working as a waitress at a restaurant in Hanford, California in 2018, 38-year-old Stacey Mendoza befriended a lonely Vietnam War veteran in his 70s named Kenneth Coyle. She spent the next several months gaining his trust and access to his bank account, which she began siphoning money from the moment the opportunity arose. One day in April 2018, Mendoza and her husband Jose went to Coyle's home, where they restrained, beat and tortured him until he gave them his banking passwords. The couple then bludgeoned and suffocated the victim to death. A few days later, the Mendozas rented a U-Haul and loaded Coyle's body into it. They drove to a rural area and burned the remains while their 3 children watched. Coyle's charred remains were found among a pile of garbage and several of his belongings in the abandoned U-Haul at the burn site, leading investigators to believe that the killers tried to disguise the scene as a trash dump. After burning Coyle's body, the couple returned to his house to steal more of his belongings and to try obtaining the deed to his property. While they were there, a property manager spotted the couple and called the police, who tracked the pair down at a restaurant in Los Angeles. Authorities intervened just in time to stop Jose Mendoza from boarding a flight to El Salvador. Following an investigation, Hanford Police Captain Carl Anderson told the Hanford Sentinel that the Mendozas had done extensive research on the best ways to get their hands on Coyle's money, including the possibility of becoming his power of attorney. They apparently decided that killing him was the easiest route. Stacey Mendoza was convicted of first-degree murder and was sentenced to life in prison without parole. The outcome of Jose's case is unclear. 6. Shirley CASSARA. After being widowed twice by the age of 55, Eldon Bowen longed for lasting companionship. In 2003, he met a church-going woman 8 years his senior named Shirley Inez CASSARA. At just 4 feet 11 inches tall and with a soft-spoken grandmotherly demeanor, Shirley hardly seemed like someone to fear. She'd been married 3 times, but Eldon didn't see this as a red flag after hearing about how Shirley's past husbands had mistreated her. Shirley and Eldon married in 2004 after a whirlwind romance and settled down in Virginia. It wasn't long before Shirley asked her new husband to put her name on the deed to his house, which Eldon was happy to do. He also gave Shirley access to his bank accounts. Eldon later told the ID channel show, Who the Bleep Did I Marry?, that Shirley's personality changed overnight roughly 2 months into the marriage. She became constantly angry and began calling Eldon names, insulting him and picking arguments with him on a regular basis. At first, Eldon assumed Shirley was having a bad day whenever she lashed out at him. But it began happening too often to overlook, especially as Shirley's temper reached new extremes. During an argument one day, she stormed out of the house. Eldon went outside a little later and discovered that someone had keyed his truck. A few weeks later, Shirley called 911 and falsely accused Eden of hitting her. She allegedly showed officers a self-inflicted wound and blamed it on her husband. Eldon was arrested and called his son to bail him out. He discovered later that evening that his checking account had been emptied. A bank employee revealed that Shirley had withdrawn all the money the day before she had Eldon arrested. The situation worsened when the judge overseeing the domestic violence case granted Shirley a 2-year restraining order, banning Eldon from going anywhere near his own home. With her husband out of the picture, Shirley got rid of all his belongings. Eldon filed for divorce, but Shirley refused to sign the papers. Meanwhile, she began barraging her estranged husband with harassing and threatening phone calls, which Eldon did his best to ignore. One day he answered the phone, and Shirley filed a police report against him for violating the protective order. After hearing rumors that Shirley planned to marry another man, Eldon investigated her background and discovered that she had in fact remarried while their divorce was still pending. She'd also married Eldon while still married to her previous husband. A police investigation found that several of Shirley's past marriages had overlapped, and she had been married not 4 times like Eldon thought, but 10 times. He was her 8th husband. Several of Shirley's past husbands told eerily similar stories of being falsely accused of abuse and drained of their money and assets. In 2010, authorities charged Shirley with embezzlement, bigamy, and fraud. She became known among locals as the gold-digging grandma and was sentenced to 2 years in prison. 5. Angelina Rodriguez. 41-year-old U.S. military veteran Frank Rodriguez met his future wife, 32-year-old Angela, while working at a boot camp for wayward youth in San Luis Obispo, California. He was instantly smitten with the single mother, who'd also served in the armed forces. The couple married in April 2000, just months after meeting, leaving their friends and family shocked. It was Frank's 2nd marriage and Angelina's 4th. Frank was a quiet church-going man who was quick to trust others. Prosecutors would later argue that these traits made him an easy target for Angelina, who had a checkered history of jumping from one relationship to the next and chasing after money and attention. She was also a habitual liar, according to friends and family, including one relative who told the Los Angeles Times that Angelina went as far as faking a pregnancy and a miscarriage before she met Frank. After the wedding, Frank took a job as a school teacher. He didn't make the kind of money Angelina was after, and he was worth more dead than alive after Angelina took out a $250,000 life insurance policy on him shortly into the marriage. Friends would later tell the court that Angelina talked about how she should just kill Frank and get it over with so that she could receive the payout. At the time, they assumed it was a distasteful but harmless joke. A few months after the couple tied the knot, Frank fell mysteriously ill. Plagued by an excruciating headache and unable to keep food down, he visited the emergency room twice. Each time, doctors told Frank that it was food poisoning and to go home and just rest it off. He died in September of 2000, just 4 months into the marriage. The cause of Frank's death was a mystery. His body showed no injuries and a standard toxicology test turned up no evidence of poisoning. Unable to collect on Frank's health insurance until a cause of death was determined, Angelina tipped authorities off with her suspicion that a vengeful co-worker poisoned her husband during a recent outing. Everyone police interviewed seemed truly distraught over Frank's death, including the co-worker Angelina had accused of poisoning him. Back at square one and now suspicious of Angelina, investigators befriended the widow and made her think that they saw her as an ally who was helping them to get to the bottom of her husband's suspicious death. Acting on information from Angelina herself and Frank's sister, the medical examiner found traces of a poisonous flower called oleander in his body, along with a deadly amount of ethylene glycol, better known as antifreeze. Meanwhile, the growing stack of evidence against Angelina was largely circumstantial but abundant. She was having an affair, had complained to friends about being bored with Frank, and had tried leading detectives on a wild goose chase as if to distract them from focusing on her. In February 2001, police confronted Angelina with proof that she had told them multiple lies. After learning that her allegations against Frank's co-worker had been disproven, she tried to claim that her husband must have taken his own life. She stubbornly insisted that she had nothing to do with Frank's death, but was hauled off to jail on suspicion of first-degree murder. During her trial, the court heard about Angelina's sordid past, including evidence suggesting that she may have killed one of her own children and blamed the manufacturer of the child's pacifier. She received a $750,000 settlement in that case. The jury convicted Angelina of first-degree murder and she was sentenced to death. With executions in California currently halted due to a statewide moratorium, it looks as though the death penalty may be abolished, in which case her sentence would be commuted to life in prison. She continues to maintain her innocence to this day. 4. Pamela and Phillips. Gary Triano was a highly successful real estate developer from Tucson, Arizona, who ran in social circles with other millionaires including Donald Trump. After playing a round of golf at an upscale country club one afternoon in 1996, the twice-divorced father of 5 got into a Lincoln Town car that he was borrowing from a friend. The car instantly exploded, blowing him to pieces just days before his 53rd birthday and sending debris dozens of yards across the parking lot. Police identified the weapon as a remote-controlled pipe bomb that was most likely activated by someone in the parking lot as they watched Gary get into his car. It also seemed likely that Gary's murder was masterminded by someone who knew him personally and was aware of his routine. But Gary knew a lot of people and wasn't hard to find, so this didn't necessarily make it any easier to track down his killer. Someone had called the country club and asked if Gary was there that day, but investigators didn't know who the caller was. Considering the amount of money Gary was worth and his business ties with casinos, the murder quickly sparked rumors of a mob hit. A closer look at his finances revealed that he had lost a massive amount of money in recent years due to bad business dealings. He was up to his eyeballs in debt and had declared bankruptcy 2 years before his death. Despite being financially tapped out and owing money to a lot of people, there was no evidence that anyone was angry enough to kill Gary. Detectives began to focus on his personal life and quickly eliminated 2 out of the 3 women he had children with. In the process, they learned that his second wife, Pamela Phillips, had divorced him in 1994 after he went broke, because he could no longer afford the lavish lifestyle she demanded. Rumors long swirled about Pam being a homewrecker who'd interfered with Gary's first marriage and was only after his money. When the marriage between Gary and Pam ended after 7 years, Pam moved to Aspen, Colorado. The former couple began to fight bitterly over money, with Pam accusing Gary of hiding assets and demanding higher child support payments. She was a successful real estate entrepreneur in her own right, but it apparently wasn't enough to uphold her taste for the finer things in life. While shopping around Aspen in search of a new husband, Pam met a man named Ronald Young. He wasn't rich, but he had business management skills, and he offered to help Pam develop her website, which revolved around horoscopes for babies. As the friendship between Pam and Ronald grew close, Gary began to worry that someone was following and keeping tabs on him. When his girlfriend asked why, he reportedly mentioned a $2 million life insurance policy that listed his 2 children with Pam as the beneficiaries. Because the kids were under 18, the money would go to Pam if he died. Pam had a rock-solid alibi for her whereabouts on the day of Gary's murder, which ruled her out as the actual killer. But investigators were highly suspicious of her connection with Young, who had a track record for stealing his client's credit. Shortly before the bombing, a van rented by Young was found abandoned in California with papers detailing Pam and Gary's divorce and a sawed-off shotgun. Further investigation indicated that Pam had agreed to pay Young $400,000 for killing Gary, which she wired to him in installments. Even more suspiciously, Young had fled to Colorado after Gary's murder and was nowhere to be found. He was picked up in Florida on forgery and embezzlement charges in 2005 after being featured on America's Most Wanted, and was charged with Gary's murder 3 years later. In 2009, authorities captured Pam in Vienna, Austria, and extradited her back to the US to face murder and conspiracy charges. Ronald Young was found guilty of murder in 2010 and is serving 2 consecutive life terms. 4 years later, and 18 years after Gary's death, Pamela Phillips was also convicted of murder and was sentenced to life without parole. She continues to maintain her innocence from behind bars. 3. BIBHU Prakash SWAIN. By all outward appearances, BIBHU Prakash SWAIN had little to offer a bride. He was in his 60s, overweight, and 5'2". Yet he managed to scam at least 27 women throughout India over a period of many years. Using marriage websites, he posed as an esteemed 51-year-old college professor, a doctor, and a high-earning government-appointed medical expert. SWAIN targeted intelligent women over the age of 40 who had good jobs. His victims included a high-ranking border patrol agent, an accountant, several teachers, a doctor, 2 Supreme Court advocates, and several government employees. To reel the women in, SWAIN preyed on the societal pressure they felt to find a husband. Speaking to the Hindustan Times, sociologist Rita Ray explained that Indian culture frowns upon unmarried women, who are often considered an economic burden to their families, and that it creates a perceived obligation to get married. In some cases, victims noticed that SWAIN looked older than he claimed to be. They overlooked it in consideration of all he claimed he had to offer, which included offers to help their kids get into medical school. One woman who married SWAIN in 2018 was both shocked and suspicious when SWAIN began leaving the home for months at a time, claiming he was out of town on business. Someone tipped her off to SWAIN's many other marriages, and like several of the other women who were being scammed, she left. She also launched a complaint with law enforcement in 2021, and an investigation ensued. Detectives uncovered evidence that SWAIN took large amounts of gold jewelry and cash from his wives, including valuables that the woman's family had taken out high-interest loans to pay for, in the good faith belief that their daughter was marrying a doctor. He also developed a habit of calling his wives and claiming that he was stranded at an airport due to a cancelled flight and that he needed money to get home. In some cases, SWAIN would call a victim up with a story about a sudden illness, claiming he needed money to pay for medical treatment. He promised to repay the money, but never did. He also had a long history of committing different types of fraud, including a credit card scam in 2006 that involved using 128 credit cards to fool 13 different banks. While following SWAIN's trail, investigators discovered that he was traveling all over the country to keep up his relationships in what authorities have described as India's biggest ever marriage scam. After establishing SWAIN's pattern of movement, law enforcement got one step ahead of him and waited for his predicted arrival in the city of Bhubaneswar. Police finally nabbed him in early 2022, and the case appears to be ongoing. 2. Anne McDonald. Self-made millionaire Rich McDonald owned a pest control business in Marin, California, which he ran with the help of his wife, 56-year-old Anne. The couple both had expensive taste and enjoyed a lavish lifestyle, which included a yacht club membership, an upscale home in one of the nation's wealthiest suburbs, and a place among society's elite social circles. But the marriage wasn't as blissful as it seemed on the surface. Rich was Anne's 5th husband, and by 1991 she'd gotten bored with him and was having an affair with another man named Al Brownberger. She felt secondary to Rich's preoccupation with the yacht club, and while Al didn't make much money and was a failed businessman, he gave Anne the attention she craved and wasn't getting at home. Suspecting his wife was cheating on him, Rich hired a private investigator. After having his suspicions confirmed, Al was brutally attacked. Anne and Al ran off to Arizona, but Anne returned after Rich cut off her access to money. One day, Anne dialed 911 and reported that her husband had been brutally beaten to death. Police immediately suspected her of being involved after learning of the couple's troubled marriage. They theorized that Anne had Rich killed because it was the only way she thought she could get away from him without being cut off financially. Old-fashioned detective work led authorities to 35-year-old Manuel Martinez, who admitted under the condition of immunity that he was paid $35,000 to kill Rich McDonald. He told investigators that Ann and Al told him to make it look like a robbery gone wrong. Both Ann and Al were convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to life in prison. Ann died behind bars from natural causes in 2013 at the age of 79. Martinez avoided any punishment thanks to his immunity agreement, and his accomplice, Larry Smith, served 2 years in prison. 1. Ashley Benefield. 24-year-old former ballerina and bikini model Ashley Byers met Navy veteran and successful businessman Doug Benefield at a Republican Party fundraiser in Palm Beach, Florida in 2016. Although Doug was more than 30 years older than Ashley, the chemistry was there, and the two married less than 2 weeks later. Ashley quickly became pregnant and moved to Florida to live with her mum, while Doug stayed behind in South Carolina. His daughter, Eva, would later tell the court that this was when the first signs surfaced of the marriage being in trouble. Doug, nevertheless, wanted to help his new wife achieve her dreams, so he financed the startup of Ashley's ballet company, the American National Ballet. But it didn't last for long, because Doug ran into business problems and began to hemorrhage money, causing the ballet company to fall apart. The couple began to fight bitterly amid their newfound money issues and cheating allegations, and Ashley filed for divorce in 2020. But a divorce wouldn't be necessary, because Doug was shot dead inside Ashley's mother's home in Lakewood Ranch, Florida one September afternoon. Police arrived to find him lying on a bedroom floor with multiple bullet wounds. Ashley claimed she shot her husband in self-defense, but quickly lawyered up and refused to answer questions. Law enforcement concluded that all signs pointed toward Ashley killing Doug in cold blood. According to an affidavit, Doug's gunshot wounds indicated that Doug wasn't even facing Ashley when she pulled the trigger. Furthermore, a neighbor reportedly told police that there were no signs of injury to Ashley. No torn clothing, bruises, cuts, or anything else. Authorities charged her with second-degree murder. For many, the questions that remain are whether Ashley married Doug for money, and if she killed him because the money ran out. She continues to maintain her innocence under Florida's Stand Your Ground law and is scheduled for her next court hearing in July 2023. Would you rather date a financially stable partner who you like but aren't crazy over, or would you prefer to be with a broke person who you're absolutely head over heels for? Let us know in the comments below. And if you enjoyed this video, be sure to subscribe to the channel. Thanks so much for watching, and we'll see you in the next one. Bye guys!